This day in sports history. This episode is brought to you by Sterling Soap Company. How often do you think about your soap? Well, if you answered, not much, maybe you should. You see, a lot of what passes for soap in stores is technically not soap, according to the FDA's definition. It's full of lab-created chemicals and detergents because, well, it's cheaper to make. Now, what if you could buy natural soap made from natural ingredients like tallow, palm oil, coconut oil, and scented with essential oils, and for just a little more than you'd pay for grocery store soap? Sterling Soap is 100% natural, and with a wide variety of bath soaps, shave soaps, beard balm, lotions, and cologne, there's a product and a scent for just about everybody. Check them out for yourself at sterlingsoap.com. That's STIRLING soap.com. It's November 14th, and this is a somber day on the sports calendar. On this day in 1970, the plane carrying the Marshall football team back to Huntington, West Virginia, crashed, killing all 75 aboard. Southern Airways Flight 932 took off from Kinston's Stallings Field, carrying 37 Thundering Herd football players, 8 staff, and 25 athletic boosters after Marshall's 17-14 loss at East Carolina earlier in the day. Any loss is a tough one, but the 3-point defeat to the Pirates had stung. In the final minute of the game, Marshall had the football at the Pirate 25-yard line. On third down, quarterback Ted Shoebridge dropped back to pass, but feeling the pressure, he threw the ball out to the flat that landed at the feet of a Marshall receiver in the area. The referee called intentional grounding, though, and it forced Marshall out of field goal range, and a long pass down the field on fourth down fell incomplete. East Carolina ran out the clock. Ball game over. The plane was a DC-9 with 2 pilots, 2 flight attendants, and the charter coordinator. It was a bit unusual for Marshall to fly in the first place. The 3 other road games they'd played so far had all been in Ohio, and so a fairly easy bus ride. Add to that, there were lingering doubts to even charter this flight. Memories were still fresh of the plane crash carrying members of the Wichita State football team in October that killed 31. As Southern Airways Flight 932 approached Tri-State Airport at 7:23 p.m., radio contact with the tower was established, and they advised the crew that rain, fog, smoke, and a ragged ceiling were at the airport, making landing more difficult, but possible. The pilot, though, had never landed a plane at West Virginia's Tri-State Airport. At 7:34, the plane passed the airport's outer marker and was given clearance to land. But the plane did not descend to the proper altitude and hold. Instead, with limited visibility, the plane continued its descent. The flight crew was unaware of any issues until just before impact. It hit the tops of trees west of their intended runway and crashed nose first before bursting into flames. It is the worst single disaster in U.S. sports history. Defensive coordinator Red Dawson was never scheduled to be on that flight. He had driven to the game with the intent to go on a recruiting visit to Ferrum Junior College after the East Carolina game. He and assistant coach Gail Parker heard about the crash on their way to Ferrum. Parker had flown down on the plane, but he had switched seats with assistant coach Deke Brackett for the return trip. Defensive back Nate Ruffin had injured his arm but was originally scheduled to make the trip, even though he wouldn't play. At the last minute, his seat was given to a football donor. Defensive lineman Ed Carter would have been on the flight if not for the death of his father and a premonition by his mother. Carter had flown to Texas for his father's funeral. His original intention was to fly to North Carolina and play in the game, but his mother begged him to stay a few extra days. Carter said, "She told me she did not want me to be on the plane my team would be on because she felt the plane was going to crash. I was taught as a child to obey my parents. That lesson I learned kept me from getting on that plane." However, Carter's name was on the passenger list and was listed among the dead initially. Rick Tagling should have been on the trip, but he overslept and he missed the bus to the airport. The entire state went into mourning. The survivors who felt like they should have been on that plane but weren't struggled with survivor's guilt. Dawson was named interim head coach until Jack Lingle was brought in to rebuild the program. Dawson stayed as an assistant coach for the 71 season, but retired from football after that and never coached again. The movie We Are Marshall, starring Matthew McConaughey as Lingle, Matthew Fox as Red Dawson, and Anthony Mackie as Nate Ruffin, was released in 2006, and it focused on the aftermath and the struggles of the emotional 1971 season. Just outside the Student Center on Marshall's campus, there's the Memorial Fountain. There will be a memorial service there today with a laying of a wreath, and then the water will be cut off until next spring as a remembrance of the 75 lives lost on this day in 1970. On this day in 1988, the plane carrying Davis Love Jr. and 3 others crashed just shy of the runway in Jacksonville, Florida. There were no survivors. Love Jr. had been a professional golfer and was a certified teaching professional. He finished in a tie for 6th place at the 1969 British Open at Royal Lytham in St. Anne's. He'd won a couple of tournaments earlier in the 60s, such as the Carolinas Open and the Georgia PGA Championship. He had a beautiful golf swing, and he passed that on to his son. Davis Love III's career as a PGA Tour professional was starting to blossom in 1988. As a 24-year-old, he'd already won on the PGA Tour in just his second year. On this day, 53-year-old Davis Love Jr., 37-year-old John Papa, 35-year-old Jimmy Hodges, and 39-year-old pilot Chip Worthington took off from St. Simon's Island en route to Jacksonville International Airport. Now, it's only about 75 miles from St. Simon's to Jacksonville, so a little over an hour drive. The flight would take about 20 minutes. The short flight allowed the 4 men to spend a little extra time with their families, and when the plane took off from St. Simon's at 8:23 p.m., the sky was clear. A pre-flight check of the weather in Jacksonville was either 5 miles visibility with some haze or 2 miles with fog, depending on the exact time that Worthington checked in. He didn't know it at the time, but conditions were deteriorating rapidly. He filed a visual flight rules plan. The fog got worse in Jacksonville. At 8:39, the Jacksonville Tower told Worthington he was cleared for runway 7. At 8:52 p.m., the plane was a mile out from the airport when Worthington keyed the mic for the last radio transmission. The plane never arrived at the airport. Instead, the plane crashed 1,400 feet short of the runway, and it wasn't until the following morning, when the fog finally lifted, that the plane was discovered. Are you a hockey fan? Then you'll love Eric Zweig's new book, Hockey Hall of Fame True Stories 2. It's a treasure trove of untold tales, bizarre incidents, and captivating trivia that will leave even the most devoted puckhead astounded. The intense rivalries, epic showdowns, and historic clashes that shaped the NHL's early years, it's all in there. Zweig uncovers the true stories that helped shape the sport, ensuring that you will never look at hockey the same way again. Check out Hockey Hall of Fame True Stories 2 on Amazon or wherever fine books are sold. On this day in 1899, the Sewanee football team played their 5th game in 6 days and won them all. And not only that, they were not scored on during that stretch. Sewanee, also known as the University of the South, were the Tigers, and they were a force in college football right around the turn of the 20th century. They started off the season with wins at Georgia and Georgia Tech, followed that up with a win against the Tennessee Volunteers and another against Southwestern Presbyterian. They won those games by a combined score of 144-0. And then they embarked on a Southwestern football odyssey that is equal parts amazing for its quantity, brevity, and success. This swing of games in such a short time span came about because of a disagreement Sewanee had with Vanderbilt about the sharing of gate receipts. That game, originally scheduled for November 25th, got scrubbed from the 99 schedule, and as a way to make up for the lost revenue, the team went on a barnstorming-like adventure. The Tigers' first game on the journey was November 9th at the University of Texas. In front of about 2,500 people, they dispatched of the Longhorns 12-0. From Austin, they headed south to Houston to play Texas A&M the following day, and they won that one 10-0. Back on the train to New Orleans for a game against Tulane on the 11th, which the Tigers won 23-0. They took the next day off, traveling to Baton Rouge to play the LSU Tigers. That was a 34-0 win for Sewanee. And then back on the train again to Memphis, Tennessee for a neutral site game against Ole Miss on this day. Sewanee wrapped up their trip with a 12-0 win. 5 wins in 6 days by a combined score of 91-0. And with Sewanee being an Episcopal-based school, it's only fitting to add, and on the 7th day, they rested. So surely they had a large roster of guys, right? I mean, 5 games in a week, they needed a lot of subs. They did not. They only had 18 players that made the 2,500-mile journey, earning them the nickname the Iron Men. They resumed a more reasonable schedule of games and closed out the season with wins against Cumberland, Auburn, and North Carolina. They only gave up 10 points all season long, and those coming in an 11-10 win over the John Heisman-coached Auburn Tigers. And on this day in 2012, Zlatan Ibrahimovic scored one of the most unbelievable goals in the history of the world. And the only reason that this goal is not more highly celebrated than it already is that it happened in an international friendly. So, this is Ibra's Swedish national team playing England. Sweden led 3-2 thanks to Ibra's hat trick already, with 4 minutes of added time just added to the second half clock. A ball was played over the top from the middle third of the field. Zlatan was covered, but he was running towards that spot. The ball took a high bounce off the turf. England goalkeeper Joe Hart was 5 yards outside his box, and so he couldn't touch it with his hands. His header was fairly weak. Zlatan saw Hart coming, and after working out the scenario in his head, he stopped, backed up a few steps, and when Hart's weak header came over the top of his head, he turned his back to the goal, ran to it, and went full-on bicycle kick. From 32.5 yards out, Ibrahimovic struck the ball with his right foot, sending the ball arcing towards the goal. Hart was too far out to have any chance to get to it. A lone English defender tried to save it off the line, but it was simply too perfect to be stopped. It was his 4th goal of the day, and simply astonishing to watch. Whether you've seen this goal 1,000 times or never, it is worth a watch every time. And I've put a link to the YouTube video in the show notes. And time now for today's Nothing to Do with Sports Did You Know? And with all the talk about planes crashing in this episode, I thought I'd include one more, which actually had survivors. The creator of Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry, survived a plane crash. In 1947, he was the 3rd officer of Pan Am Flight 121 that crashed into the Syrian desert. 15 people, 7 crew and 8 passengers, were killed. As the highest-ranking surviving officer, Roddenberry led people off the burning wreckage and then organized scout parties. They were eventually rescued by the Syrian army. Soon after, he left Pan Am to pursue his dream of being a screenwriter. Okay, it seems like a good time to assure you that despite today's episode, traveling by plane is still the safest way to travel. The odds of dying in a plane crash are about 1 in 13.7 million these days, so buckle up and enjoy the friendly skies. That's all I've got for you today. Come on back tomorrow for an episode of This Day in Sports History. Hang on a second, let me just check. An episode where nobody dies. This has been an original Thrive Suite production.